Hello, my name is Colleen Fisk, and I work for an organization called Renewable Energy Alaska Project. Today, we're going to be doing an introduction to wind energy and thinking about where is it windy and where do we put wind turbines. So starting out, I want you to think about how did humans first harness wind energy? Now, you've had a second to think about it. Might have thought about windmills or kites, and some of you might have even thought far enough back, and it's actually sailboats were the first way that humans first harnessed wind energy. After sailboats, then we started having windmills. And windmills, this picture is from Afghanistan, about 8,500, and they used it to grind some grain. Around the same time in China, they were using kites as well. It wasn't until much later on that we start seeing, like in the 1800s, start seeing this type of windmill that you might be a little bit more familiar with today that could also pump water. You might see something like this as a Dutch windmill, and it wasn't until the early 1900s that we start seeing wind turbines that actually produce electricity. This is one of the earliest versions that you can see there. You might be a little bit more familiar with the standard type of wind turbines in that picture that you see in the bottom right there that we use currently to produce electricity. So if we step back a second, let's do a little reminder about how wind is made, because this is important when we think about where do we find out where is it windy and where do we actually put wind turbines. So you might remember that there's differences in atmospheric pressure because of the uneven heating of the Earth's surface. So especially if you think about water versus land, or different areas of the Earth get different amount of sun during different times of the year. And so that creates that difference in atmospheric pressure. The Coriolis effect, or the effect of the air movement because of the rotation of the Earth, causes global wind patterns, like the trade winds. And then the differences in atmospheric pressure tend to cause more localized wind. So here's a little diagram of the Coriolis effect. If you have a chance, I'd highly recommend you going to ventusky.com. You can really see the global wind patterns. It shows the current wind speeds all around the world. You can see the global wind patterns, and then you can also zoom in on your area, your town, or somewhere else that you want to look at, and see what the current wind speed is. This website also does things like show you precipitation and temperature. So if we come back to Alaska, specifically thinking about wind turbines, we want to know how much electricity we actually use from wind. Well, as you can see from this graph, it's pretty small, only about 2%, and this is from July 2019. As you can see, most of our electricity is coming from natural gas and hydro. Different times of the year will also be affected. If you look back, the next graph is March 2018. That was closer to 3%, but around 2 to 3% is what we produce for our electricity. But it's definitely growing throughout the state. If we start thinking about the importance of the wind resource, we can start thinking about where we can actually place our wind turbines. Now, one of the first things that you can do is use historical data, people who have lived in a place for a really long time, who understand where the wind is and where it's mostly windy. You can also use your observations. Here you can see this tree where the trunk is. Most of the branches are going one direction. And so you can see that the wind had to have been consistent enough for a long enough time that the wind is mostly blowing, in this case, the photo from left to right. And these are photos on Fire Island. So once you have an idea of this tree flagging, or you've talked to some people, or you have some historical records, then you can put up what's called a MET tower, or meteorological tower. You put that up for at least a year to get really specific data about an area to see if you can put a wind turbine there. You also want to think about the turbulence of the wind. It doesn't just have to be really windy, but it should be really smooth wind so that it's not really hard on the wind turbines. So in this case, this is a little image showing that you can see this really roiling turbulence on the other side of this structure, in this case, a little house, but this could be a tree or a ridge or a hill or any other object. And anytime you have wind blowing from one direction, you have to be at least 2 times the height above it or 20 times the height away from it to avoid that turbulence. And so that's one of the reasons why you see wind turbines that are really tall and really far away from structures. You also see that as elevation increases, wind speed increases. You tend to have less friction. And this is different than necessarily going up higher in the sky, but really just higher elevation from the ground. You also see that the higher the tower is, the faster the wind is. So in this case, on the bottom right, you can see the wind speed in meters per second, and then the height of the tower, the wind turbine tower on the left in meters. And so as you go higher up the meters, a number of meters, then you start getting higher speed. So both of these things are really important and why you see taller wind turbines. Kind of get a scale of wind turbines. Can see some of these smaller wind turbines that you might see at home or a business or farm. These larger wind farm turbines that are around 110 meters they measure at the hub at the center of where the blades are. And these are the things that you might see on Fire Island, Eva Creek, Pillar Mountain, these different wind farms that we have around the state of Alaska. And those can be even taller than the Statue of Liberty. Now, we don't have any in Alaska right now, but offshore wind turbines are even bigger. So they can really dwarf even bigger ones. And if you think about offshore, they really don't have anything that's obstructing that wind, and so it can be really smooth wind. We're going to be focusing on, of course, onshore wind, because that's what we have in Alaska and mostly where more wind turbines are being put up. Here's another example of the scale of the Fire Island wind turbines that we see just outside of Anchorage. And so if these wind turbines were in downtown Anchorage, you can see that they're around the same height as these really tall buildings that we have in downtown Anchorage. Other things you have to consider when you're putting in wind turbines are wildlife impacts. So you have to be thinking about, are birds or bats going to be affected by these? Are they put in migratory paths? Are there hibernating animals or other animals that might be impacted by where we dig up and place this wind turbine? We want to make sure that we are reducing any effect that we have on the wildlife. And so that's why there's special permitting that's associated with that anytime you put in a wind turbine or any other energy project. You have to consider these wildlife impacts. Another thing to think about when you're putting a wind turbine is where are your transmission lines? You have to be able to get that electricity to where people are using it. And so in this map, which comes from Renewable Energy Atlas, you can see that we have transmission lines all up and down between Fairbanks down to the Kenai Peninsula. And then this is the pipeline that goes up to North Slope. But then you see there aren't transmission lines connecting to the rest of rural parts of Alaska, remote areas of the state. So even though it might be really windy in some of these other areas, they may be producing more wind than what they can use. We can't just send it over to where some other people live, like in Anchorage or Fairbanks or the Kenai Peninsula, because we don't have the transmission lines there. That's a really far away and costs a lot of money to do that. And so that's why you want to be thinking about those resources and where they are locally. There are, of course, some downsides to wind energy, just like with any type of energy project. So wind is intermittent, which means that it's not consistent. Sometimes it's windy and sometimes it isn't. Of course, it does kill some birds and bats. However, if you look at this graph, which came from the Wildlife Service, you can see that wind turbines do kill some birds, but they are not killing nearly as many of these other sources such as cats. So it is something to think about. And like I said before, that's part of why you have special permits when you put in wind turbines. It's really expensive to maintain anywhere, but especially in rural Alaska, they have special considerations. It takes up space and it can be noisy. So some people can be really bothered by the noise. Of course, there are some positive impacts or upsides to this. You don't have any burning of the fuel. So therefore you don't have the air pollution or greenhouse gas emissions. There's no water consumption or other pollution. Diversifies our energy portfolio. So even though right now it's only 2 to 3% of how we produce our electricity in the state, it still gives us other options than just natural gas or coal, or oil, which is what we mostly use throughout the state. And of course, it also provides economic benefits like many other energy projects. Creates jobs. Wind can reduce the cost of energy, although it really depends on the area. Some landowners, if they have wind turbines on theirs, they can get money. and it can contribute to local taxes as well. One thing to consider is the maintenance of the wind turbine. And so this is kind of a positive and a negative because it does take a lot of maintenance, but that also creates jobs. And most energy projects are going to have some maintenance anyway. Wind does take a lot of resources to harvest. So Siri, who owns Fire Island Wind, made up this little graph here, or little chart image here. And so it shows how many tons of steel, copper, concrete, aluminum, other rare earth metals that it takes to build this wind turbine. So it is using resources. But this is also true of any other type of energy resource that you are going to be building. So where are the wind resources? And this is where, if you have that worksheet ready to use, this is where it's asking you, we look at this picture and it says, looking at the topographical map of Alaska, and that's this one. I think it's question 5. Sorry, I don't have that right in front of me right now. Looking at the topographical map of Alaska, where do you think it's windy? So pause this video, take a second to look at this, maybe use some of your own knowledge, and where do you think it is windy? Write that down. Okay, now that you've had a second to write that down, and unpause this video, we can look at the next map, shows where the wind speed, where it's windy, the wind speed. So on the left here, you can see this is the scale that shows different colors, so different wind speed. Up in like the purple and blues, it's really windy, whereas the greens and yellows, it's not as windy. So you can see where it is really windy is in Western Alaska, especially along the coastlines or on islands and on the Aleutian chains. That's where we see the highest wind speeds. You can see that up to like 7.5 to 9 meters per second. And this is looking, if you notice, this is at 80 meters, because if you remember back to how tall wind turbines are, that's about the height that we're looking at our wind turbines, is at 80 meters. Now that we've seen where it's windy, and you might have remembered looking at that map before, do you know where the wind farms are? So looking at this map, pause this video and answer that next question. Where do you think, or where do you already, maybe you already know, where some of the wind farms are? Okay, now that you've had a chance to write that down, you can see here's a map of, this is looking at just renewable energy resources. You can also use that renewable energy map again if you'd like to, but this is looking at just renewable energy resources. And so you can see these little wind turbine icons, and it shows where you have wind. And of course, unsurprisingly, it's in Western Alaska, the islands, and in the Aleutian chains where you see most of the wind turbines. Of course, you do see other areas where you have wind turbines. Okay, of course, we have some in Anchorage. There's Petersburg even has one in Southeast. There's some other places that have some wind, but you can still see that most of it is on the coast in Western Alaska and the Aleutian chains, just like where we saw where it was windy. All right, so now what I want you to do is answer the next questions comparing this to the US. So looking at this topographical map of the US, where do you think that is? Look, and then you compare that to make a guess. Okay, where do you think it is really windy? Then once you look at the next map that shows you where it is really windy, then where are the wind farms? And you can start going from there. So I'll leave you to it. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.